So, hello everybody. My name is Ñāṇiko. If you went to Abhayagiri, my home monastery in California, you would hear people calling me Ajahn Ñāṇiko. Ajahn is a word that just comes from the Pali word acharya, which means teacher. Over 10 years as a bhikkhu, as a Buddhist monk, you get the term teacher, whether you teach or not. You're called Ajahn. This is Tan Yasa. Tan is venerable in Thai. So we've got Ajahn and Tan. These are Thai words, but we're both bhikkhus. We both follow the same set of rules. And
sorry,
yeah,
I'm seeing that the lavalier isn't attached.
Oh. Hopefully, you can still hear me. Is this just for the live stream? This okay? The live stream didn't hear that first part. Never mind. So in Abhayagiri, you would call me Ajahn Ñāṇiko and Tan Yasa, but for here, especially if people are new to monasticism or Buddhism, I can also just be called Ñāṇiko and Yasa. We don't need the honorifics. That's also totally okay, and we won't hold it against you or go quiet and be internally upset and passive aggressive. So. Yeah, I'm the abbot of the monastery, have been for 3 years now, and I've been there for 20 years. It's 20 years ago that I went to Abhayagiri, that I wandered off the street into Abhayagiri as a stoned out surfer, and who would have thought I would be the abbot of one of the most prestigious training monasteries in the world, and just never would have imagined. But I just have so much gratitude for Abhayagiri and for just the teachings I've received there, and just what we're a part of. Also, we're a part of a worldwide community. I've lived in Thailand for 6.5 of the past 20 years. So I've had the opportunity to live at our monasteries in Thailand. I've spent time at Ajahn Chah's main monastery, Wat Papong. Spent 5 months there, and I've also had the opportunities to spend time in retreat in Thailand and living at very remote monasteries and going alms round. We have these bowls we rely on alms food. So I've gone alms round in extremely poor villages and relied on alms food. I lived in one place called Pujamgam. I lived there for 2.5 years, and it's like a cave monastery, and just going for alms food to this incredibly poor village, learning a lot from the villagers and connecting with them, learning about their lives, and incredibly poor monetarily wise, but incredibly rich in terms of well-being and happiness. And I didn't see depression there in the village. That's one hallmark of this extremely poor village that I lived in, I didn't see anybody who was depressed, which was kind of interesting. And these are just very hardworking farmers, and in the Isan, the rural Thailand, the northeast of Thailand. So I got to live in those kind of situations in the northeast, and I also got to meet really amazing teachers. Like my teacher at Abhayagiri, Ajahn Pasanno, has been a monk for 47 years. He's my preceptor. He's the one who ordained both of us. He's ordained almost everybody at Abhayagiri, but also had the opportunity to spend time and live with Ajahn Liam, who is he's Ajahn Chah's, you could consider him as Ajahn Chah's Dharma heir, and he's the current abbot of Wat Papong, and he's been a monk for 57, 58 years now, I think. And he's, so getting to live with him and learn from him has been a really great opportunity as seeing what's possible in the bhikkhu life. So in terms of what are we trying to do with practice, then there's this idea that we want to be more spiritual, perhaps looking at what our intention is to come and listen to a talk. And many of you probably know Tan Nisabo, who is a good friend, and he's lived at Abhayagiri. I think he was there for 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. Maybe it was just 1.5 years. But he was there for a while. And So definitely miss having him there, and now he's here in the Pacific Northwest. He's around. And what's our intention? To meditate, come and meditate. And that's one thing that's good to look at, that if we come to Buddhist practice, or we gain an interest or even a spark of faith in the teaching of the Buddha, and part of us thinks, oh, there's something to this. So it's like we're following a scent, and we're kind of wanting to look into it a little bit more. So there's that sense of interest. But then trying to look at the mind and see what's actually directing that interest. So the mind, the awareness, is always getting directed. So in meditation, we learn how to direct the awareness. So everybody here has probably learned about breath meditation before, and they say watch your breath, or direct your awareness to the breath. Maybe it's the sensation of the cool air coming into the nostrils and the warm air coming out, or you might hold a meditation word, like what we do in the Thai forest tradition is breathing in, mentally reciting But, breathing out, mentally reciting To. That's Buddho. Buddho is the same as Buddha, but we say Buddho, meaning we're recollecting the inner Buddha, the pure awareness. So that's Buddho. And so however we direct our awareness, what we learn how to do in meditation is we learn how to direct our awareness. And a lot of what the Buddha is also teaching us how to reframe how we're seeing the world. So a lot of times when we come to meditation or to spiritual practice, we might be trying to figure it out, like we're trying to figure it out, like what's going on in the world or in the universe. And the Buddha is reframing it in terms of what can we do to suffer less? What can we do? So even if we were to figure it out, the deepest secrets of the universe, would that lessen our suffering or not? Or it might even increase our suffering. We might see something we don't want to see, so it might increase our suffering. And so the Buddha is reframing things in terms of, okay, you don't need to figure everything out. All you need to do is practice in a way that you can have more ease and well-being in your life and suffer less. So that's, the Buddha said, all that he teaches is suffering and the ending of suffering. So and of course, the implications of that are vast, but we can just think about it in those terms for the time being. So directing our awareness, how do we direct our awareness, and why do we direct our awareness? So when we're meditating, we're directing our awareness to the breath process. We might also have learned about experiencing the whole body, like body sweeping, noticing where there's tension in the body, noticing where there might be pain in the body, and then also consciously calming the body. We may have learned about that as well. And then what we find is we come to meditation, and then the mind starts to wander, and we start to proliferate about whatever, or the mind isn't peaceful, the mind doesn't settle. And so at that point, that's the learning process. So that's learning how we're directing the awareness. So why is the awareness then getting redirected to something else, getting redirected to a thought, getting redirected to a proliferation about the past or a proliferation about the future, or hoping for the good food at the meal today or anything? Why is the awareness getting redirected there? So there's something behind the awareness that's actually directing it. So when the awareness gets directed to Buddho or the breath, there's that something behind it. It's this deep inside we might feel, okay, that's going to bring some benefit to us, and then the mind maybe doesn't settle right away, or doesn't happen fast enough. We don't feel much better, or it's just not happening. So then deep down inside, there's something in the heart that's saying, let's focus on that. That's going to be better. So there's a bit of a misunderstanding happening there. Deep down inside, there's a misunderstanding that focusing on this or that thing is going to actually bring us more happiness than, say, getting back to the breath, focusing on the breath and the body awareness. So the way the awareness gets directed, we start to learn about that why is the awareness getting directed in various ways. And when we start to investigate like that, we're stepping back, or we might be meditating and the awareness might go from the meditation object and then go off to something else, and then we notice it. We notice it at a certain point. We think, oh, I'm such a terrible meditator, and I don't know how to do this, and this is so difficult. But then what we don't see is the awareness is then with this self-criticism. So it's habitually going into this self-criticism, self-judgment. And then when we talk about contemplation, that's what it is why did the awareness do that? Why couldn't we just come back to the breath? Why did it go into, you're stupid, you're a bad meditator, you're supposed to be Buddhist, and you're not supposed to get angry, you're not supposed to be greedy. The mind is supposed to be pure and bright, and they said you're supposed to be blissful and getting into meditative absorptions, and it's not happening. And so I've got so much defilement, I've got all this defilement, and then just give up. I might as well just give up because this is too difficult, and I'm worthless, and just getting really it can get really self-critical. But if we step back for a minute, we say, well, that's just the awareness can get directed in that way as a habit. We have these habits, these habitual tendencies, and that's what we call vipaka, or the arising of past karma, past conditions that we've already set in place through our upbringing or whatever we've experienced in our lives up to this point. Then that's going to arise. We can't stop that from arising. But what we can do is we can curb the momentum of it with the meditation, and curb the momentum of it by calling into question, well, why that self-criticism? Why that judgment? These things they get nourished in certain ways. They get nourished in various ways. So say something like, we want to have less anger. So if we want to have less anger, I'll take anger as an example. So anger is nourished by the awareness being unskillfully directed to the negative, or directed to focusing on the negative. In a way, we're meditating on it. So like we might have something that's negative, and we actually focus on it. It's like, why does it have to be that way? It shouldn't be that way. And then that nourishes and feeds the anger and aversion in the heart, and it's like a downward spiral, and it goes on like that. So what we want is, if we have the intention of we want non-anger, or sometimes we may even be angry because of other people's anger. Why do so many people have to be angry? Why does there have to be so much hate in the world? So we might be angry at other people's anger. So seeing that what the very, very best thing we can do is actually try to nourish that non-anger. And nourishing the non-anger is trying to see the good qualities in ourselves and others. So this is a new group, and I haven't met many of you before, so don't really know what's going to be that helpful to talk about. So I might just open it up for questions now at this point. Maybe having thrown a few seeds out there. Doug.
And one thing you might have to do for the live stream is repeat the question or summarize it.
Oh, and it was hiding under my robe too, so hopefully, okay.
So what's directing the awareness? So there's intention. What's directing intention? Or is this an infinite regress?
The intention is conditioned by the vipaka. So our intentions, something I've gotten asked from time to time is, well, what is it with Buddhism? Is it fate or free will? which one is it? And the answer is it's kind of a combination of both. There is fate in the sense of causes that have been put in place in the past are going to arise as vipaka, as karma that arises either in the mind or as a sense of disease or whatever. Karma in the Buddhist teaching, by the way, it's the engine that drives the stress and suffering and happiness, because happiness and suffering are two sides of the same coin. But the Buddha's pointing towards something transcendent, that because the happiness we know is impermanent happiness, it's viparinama dukkha, so it's happiness includes the unsatisfactory nature that it changes, it doesn't last. So, but the intention, and also the Buddha said karma is intention. So we're creating fresh karma in the present, which is conditioned by the past karma. So our present motivations and intentions are conditioned by our past intentions. That's why I say we can't just do a U-turn, but we can curve it, we can curb it. So it's kind of a combination of free will and fate. There's this mysterious aspect of the present where we actually do have the freedom to say, okay, if I take responsibility for this, I can actually start nourishing the non-anger. I can start nourishing the non-greed, non-delusion, because that's what's directing things in the background. Is the three root, what the Buddha called the three root defilements, or the three root poisons in the mind. The greed, hatred, delusion. Those are very strong words, so we can think of it as, on a subtle level, attraction, aversion, and delusion, or pulling toward, pushing away, and confusion. We can think of it like that. That's what our awareness is being directed based on those deep intentions. But we can learn how to see that actually that's not helping. Actually, that those things in the background, that's actually not helping to lessen our suffering. So there has to be another way. So the other way is what is the Dhamma. And just that's why I'm incredibly grateful that we have the Buddha's teaching. Just somebody like the Buddha, a religious seeker 2,600 years ago, who discovered another way to actually through the subtlety and the intuitive wisdom in the practice, learning how to nourish non-greed, non-anger, non-delusion. In brief. See what's when we get into this, see what's happening here is that deep in the heart, so we might hear a lot of teachings, but deep in the heart, in our heart of hearts, we don't really believe it. When push comes to shove, we're going to default to certain things. And what we default to, that's where our practice is. So taking refuge in Buddhism, we talk about taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And what that means on a very deep level is that when there's some really intense difficulty in our life, that's where we go. And if we want to, we're always taking refuge in something. And so when we have a really intense difficulty in our life, where we go, if we see where we go, that's where our refuge is currently. So I can say an example of this is we had a guy who was a monk in our community a while back, and he had been a monk for 5 years. He ordained a bit later in life, and he had been from an evangelical Christian family and had left that behind and gained faith in Buddhism, wanted to be a monk. But then he had a near-death experience after his 5th year as a bhikkhu, and he had a what is that called, an embolism, like in his leg, where he almost died, and he reverted back. He went and he disrobed and went back stronger than before to evangelical Christianity. So that's where the refuge, deep in the heart, that's where the refuge still was. So like what we're looking at is refuge, Buddha Dhamma Sangha, Buddha being awareness, pure awareness, pure knowing, Dhamma being truth and truth of the way things are in the moment, Sangha being virtue. Sangha on an external level is the people practicing the Dhamma, but on an internal level it's virtue. It's taking refuge in actually virtuous moral behavior. We talk about like the 5 precepts, probably everybody here knows about that. So when we look at refuge, we take like some really difficult situation or an illness or whatever, taking refuge in awareness and looking into what's the experience of this in the present. And that's the reason we talk about these refuges, is the Buddha's talking about these refuges as sure and helpful refuges. They're not just empty and meaningless. They actually do help. So awareness actually does help. Looking into Dhamma, looking into what's the experience in the present, what's the truth of the way things are now. The body is like this, the mind is like this now. So looking into that, and then that does end up having an effect on the mind. And that's looking into things that way is what we call mindfulness or sati. So with sati, with mindfulness, that's what actually starts to curb the kama in a different direction. But we do have to have that faith and that motivation. I use the word faith. The word faith is sattha in Pali, and it's not quite the same as like a blind belief. It's an informed faith. We haven't experienced the fruits of practice yet because we haven't practiced yet. So if we haven't practiced yet, we haven't experienced the fruits, but we've maybe seen examples or read a teacher that we like or a Dhamma book that may have alluded to these fruits of practice, and we have enough confidence that we want to try and see. So the Buddha said, ehipassiko, come and see for oneself, that the fruits of the practice are to be seen for oneself. And it's one thing that's kind of kept me with the Buddha's teaching as well, is there's this idea that no one's coercing you or forcing you to practice. It's just the Buddha's laying it out there. It's like, this leads to suffering, this leads to happiness, this leads to the transcendent, and you choose. It's completely up to you, rather than like, you have to believe this, you have to do that, kind of forcing you. Anyway, I digressed. Mm-hmm.
So, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. When we get to the not self part, I think I understand it, and then I don't. I'm like a 5-year-old or somebody that's explaining, mom and dad explained it to you, and then 4 months later you ask the same question. So I'm asking this question for I don't know how many times. But not self in terms of the ego, in terms of what I understand mine are illusions, delusions. That I'm more of a verb than a noun. If there is an I, it's a series of actions. But after I get past that and ask the question, well, what is it that my awareness is not myself? What is it? Here's a string of questions. If I'm not a self and there's no soul, how does that work with the Buddhist belief in reincarnation? So I have some more on that.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you can please riff on that.
yeah. It's a lot of it is just reframing it, actually, because it's not necessary to think of what is it. It's not necessary to think of things in terms of what is it. Not self is a tool for the mind to let go. And the Buddha never said no self, also, and he never said self. So not self is anatta. So that he says the five khandhas are not self: the body, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness in terms of awareness, not self. That's anatta. But he didn't say no self. No self is a different doctrine, and that's called virata. So he said that's actually incorrect to think in terms of no self. It's like no soul, no soul, no self. That's not correct. And also self is not correct. So anatta, or not self, is somewhere in the middle. And but also it's really those three characteristics, it's more like a tool, and every person, dependent on their temperament, can gain insight through any of the three characteristics. It doesn't have to be all three, or it doesn't have to be not self. Although if one gains insight into one, there will be insight into all three, and they're all connected. So it could be anicca, which is translated as impermanence, but it also can be translated as uncertainty, or Luang Por Chah, Ajahn Chah like to translate it as not sure. So if we think of things as not sure, we might think, so anything where we get caught, where the mind isn't peaceful, it's all going to hell in a handbag, and this is happening in the world, and not sure. If we insert not sure, that's a skillful means to help us to come back to the present, reestablish mindfulness. Not self. That's like, when we might have the thought, when I die, I'm going to hell. I've done so many bad things. And, well, no, not self. That's just the body breaking up. It's just the mind breaking up. So the Buddha is saying the body is not self, the mind is not self. If we want to think in terms of what is reborn, the Buddha talks about seeing his past lives back 91 aeons on the night of his awakening, and in each life I had this and this name, I was part of this and this clan, or I was this and this class of being. He wasn't always human, sometimes even animal or celestial beings. Could be transmigrating through all these different realms of existence. So we think, well, the Buddha said, body is not self, mind is not self, so what's being reborn? And people did like to ask the Buddha himself this question often. And they would say, well, you talk about not self, and this being reborn. Like, what's reborn then? And the Buddha said, you ask a deep question about a perplexing matter. It's very subtle and hard to see. So, in terms of not self, yes, all those past lives are not self. So, what's reborn? And the Buddha said it's like you have two candles. So when the body dies, you have a candle, and the awareness is the light, the flame on the candle. And when the transmigration between lives, it's like taking one candle and lighting another candle. way we can actually be grateful for the defilements that we're born and we have this opportunity to practice Dhamma. So what is reborn is craving itself, is what is reborn. That's why when craving ends, there's no more rebirth. There can't be more rebirth because there's there's nothing to be reborn anymore.
So is it, what's reborn is craving, but is it the karma that you've added in this life that gets, that's our legacy to the world?
And the kama is balled in with the craving. Yeah. So that's how the kama continues on. Yeah.
So when the Buddha remembered however 90 past lives.
Yeah, 91 aeons, which is like trillions of past lives.
Okay. Is he remembering the dukkha that's ongoing, the biological, psychological?
Yeah, there is a thread there. There's a thread of craving that connects it all together, but that can come to an end. But because it's so habitual, we've been, and also, we might wonder, like, why don't we remember all our past lives? If there was past lives, obviously we would remember them. I've asked this question of senior monk in Thailand, and they said, well, the chitta, the heart, or the mind, has like a defense mechanism whereby it's too traumatic to remember our past death, usually. And so you actually have to get to a point where you overcome the fear of death, and then those things might start to open up a little bit. But the Buddha also said that when he remembered his past lives, he was just remembering past 5 aggregates, but there's this thread of craving connecting them all together. But that he said those past lives were actually not self as well. But it's in the teaching with the candles, he then says, he goes on to say, like, so the questioner then says, well, if you say an enlightened being doesn't take birth anymore, what happens then? And the Buddha said, well, it's like blowing out a candle. And then his questioner says, well, does a enlightened being, does their mind exist after death? And the Buddha says, well, that's not valid. Do they not exist after death? That's not valid. So the questioner says, because in Indian philosophy, you don't have the dilemma, you have what's called the quadrilemma. So do they exist and not exist after death? The Buddha says, not valid. And then they say, well, do they neither exist nor not exist after death? And then the Buddha says, not valid. And so then the guy says, well, that's every possibility. So you must either be just a fool or I'm not getting something. And the Buddha says, well, I'll ask you a series of questions in response to your questions. So when I blow out this candle, he says, did the flame go to the north? And the guy says, not valid. Did it go to the east? He says, not valid. Did it go to the south? Not valid. Did it go to the west? Not valid. And the Buddha says, well, what happened to it? And then the guy says, well, it just went out. It's simply classed as out. And the Buddha says, yes, the same. It's the same. The Tathagata, the Buddha, the thus come one, he's gone out. He's gone out from suffering, out from rebirth, out of samsara. And then he has these series of verses saying, yes, it's hard to understand, but the mind of the Buddha is vast and deep like the great ocean. So it's got this beautiful quality to it as well. So those are definitely difficult questions, but good to think about.
Curbing the anger. seeing the anger come, preparing yourself, getting in what headspace, heart space to be able to curb that?
Yeah, I've had to deal with this a lot in my own practice, my own monastic life, and I remember asking one of our teachers, Ajahn Sona, in Burke, Canada, to one of the branch monasteries there. I had this thing about I really wanted to overcome my anger, and so I thought of this idea of like, well, you have to be with the anger or be mindful of the anger. So like I would try to be with the anger, not react to it. And I had this idea, but it was very unpleasant. Like, so I'd try to, I'd get angry about something, as can happen when you live in a community with 30 people in a monastery. Oh, they did it again. And get upset, irritated. They didn't follow the rules, or they, washed the dishes in the wrong way or whatever. Then kind of getting upset. Then trying to be with it, but it didn't help. It wasn't helping. So I eventually asked Ajahn Sona. I was visiting him one time, and I said, so how do you be with the anger? I've got this, mindfulness of anger. How do you do that? And he said, well, when you establish mindfulness, you can't be angry. And so I said, well, that can't be the case. And so he said, when you think you're being mindful of anger, you're actually you're continuing to generate it somehow. And I didn't believe him. I said, no, maybe I got a little bit angry, a little bit upset. Just kind of, yeah, that can't be the case. And so, but I kept turning it over, thinking about it, and started looking at it, and yeah, there's this habit of, even though it's unpleasant, I'm habitually generating it. So even though the anger is very unpleasant, and I start feeling depressed and hopeless, and I'm going to leave the monastery and all these people, to hell with everybody, and then it actually takes courage, and this is where the word saddha, the word faith, comes in Pali. It also means courage, and you actually have to have courage to not get caught in that which is causing suffering. So seeing the suffering of it, seeing how unpleasant it is, and yet there's a fear of the unknown. I don't know non-anger. There's a fear because it's not known, it's not experienced. So then having that courage to actually take that leap of faith, it's like you're standing at an edge of a cliff, and you know off that cliff is non-anger, but you're afraid to jump because you don't know what you're going to find at the bottom. But then you actually have to just jump. And so then I could see that Ajahn Sona was 100% right. Like the moment I established mindfulness, anger is just completely gone. It's just, yeah, okay, get upset, and kind of you establish that mindfulness in the present, establish that mindfulness, or there's a brief moment where you see the anger, but you really see it with mindfulness, and then you're back. And there might still be the feelings in the body that anger causes, the chemicals that it makes shoot out of the brain or whatever, and then you watch that kind of dissipate. But the generation of it, the actual thoughts, they're just, they can be, stopped right away with mindfulness. So that's why they say mindfulness is like the brakes. It's like putting the brakes on with anger or anything that's causing us suffering. But what it takes is seeing the suffering of it, seeing the unpleasantness of the anger. So it's like, if I get angry at something or somebody, the only one who's getting harmed is me. I'm not helping them in any way by getting angry at somebody else. I'm not helping the situation either. There might be like righteous anger, like, that's it, I'm doing something about it, or like, but that's immense suffering, and that's just going to keep feeding itself. The nature of anger is it wants to, on the ultimate level, it wants to destroy, it wants to get rid of. It wants to get rid of unpleasant feeling that we're experiencing, but it's compounding it. It's compounding the unpleasantness. So the way out of it is to have that leap of faith, come back to the mindfulness, but seeing the never-ending suffering of it. Like there's no, with anger, it's leading to more and more suffering. If we act on it, it's leading to suffering for others. You know, we, on the worst possible level, we might even hurt or kill somebody. And so it's suffering for us and for others. And when we see the suffering of it, it's on a very deep level. The heart won't be able to go there again. But it takes a lot of training. So you know, it can take years of trying to kind of turn it around in different ways and look at it and try it. Sometimes we have to use skillful means to really, you know, it can happen too, like with families. Like we have these habitual ways of relating to each other that have been built up over the years. And so, like, you know, when a close friend or family member does something that has always kind of irritated us, but we've always kind of dealt with it in various ways. Maybe we kind of like, you know, repress it, or we just kind of try to like sweep it under the rug, but it kind of builds up over time, and we're kind of holding on to it and like, oh, they did it again. And so when we really see the suffering of it, though, then it can really break up. It can really break up, and there's that sense of freedom and expansive awareness, like a lightness. There's a lightness to it. Anger is very heavy. For me, I can experience it as like this heaviness. It's like you're being crushed by this anger. So it's weird. Like, why do we have it? It doesn't make any sense. So when we see that it doesn't make any sense, then I remember having this experience too, where it was actually in a dream, and it was when I was in anagarika at Abhayagiri when I was first starting out, and of course really wanting to practice hard. And I didn't want to practice loving kindness practice because metta practice is kind of for beginners. I want to do austerities. I want to, you know, really push hard in the practice and go with little sleep and just meditating all the time and getting angry also. So it's like I had this dream that because like me and my sister used to bicker and fight when we were young, and I had this dream where I was having an argument with my sister, and in the dream I just completely let go of it, and it like flipped, and I woke up in this state of like bliss. And I had this thought that, wow, if everybody knew that letting go of anger, that was the result of letting go of anger, nobody would get angry. It would just be like if you knew how happy you would be if you just let go of anger, like if you were angry and then you just completely let go of it. And you know, that even though it was just a dream, it did teach me a lot, because I just was really just letting go of the anger. I mean, the mind was kind of getting habituated to the practice a bit, so that can come up in your dreams when you practice a lot. So it's just, and that didn't end anger. I mean, but it helped a lot, that kind of reflection, and that you know, but then there's always these curveballs that come up, and you think, okay, no, today no matter what, I'm not going to get angry. Today no matter what, I'm going to let go of everything. And then some curveball would come, like the one thing I can't let go of would happen, or somebody would accuse me of something or say something, or you know, and it would just be like, you know, you got to be kidding me, like this. And that's life. That's how life works. So it's like in the practice, it's like an art. It's the art of practice. It's like spiritual qigong. All these things are coming at us, and we're having to kind of deal with them as they arise.
So as a sort of a follow-up question to that, if one is so strongly holding on to anger, you must somehow be very fond of it. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing, is there's something deep inside of us which is telling us that it's the right thing to do, that it's actually going to solve the problem somehow, that it's actually going to bring us some sort of happiness. That's the delusion. So delusion is that which we have a distorted perception. This is called sanya vipalasa. This is the distorted perception which is telling us something's going to make us happy when it's actually not. It's actually lying to us.
So do you think that's maybe the result of conditioned experience, or is it something in our psyche that's native?
Yeah, it's kind of mysterious. It's these things are the reason we're in this existence, and it's habit. It's just something. That's the very engine that drives samsara, that drives rebirth, that drives happiness and suffering. So and the reason that delusion is there too is because there might be a point when it seems like anger makes us happy. There's an illusion, like we beat the guy up that we wanted to beat up, and we feel like, yeah, I did it, and kind of like a brief moment of joy, but then we have a whole lifetime of somebody wanting revenge and whatever, all the problems so the Buddha called it anger with its poisoned root and honeyed tip, meaning there might be a little tiny bit of, but the law of karma, according to the Buddha, karma says that, and this is the exact nature of the Dhamma, what we call the Dhamma niyamata, the normality of the Dhamma, is that an intention based in anger can't result in happiness. It's impossible. Like that the actual vipaka, the result of that intention has to be suffering. It can only be that way. It can't be any other way. And similarly, like the result of greed, which is more subtle than anger, the result can't be happiness. So if we're experiencing happiness, that's the result of a skillful intention. It's not the result of anger. So but then karma is very, very quick and very subtle. So it's actually we're experiencing the results of past karma all the time, and creating new karma all the time. So the Buddha talked about things like generosity from a wholesome intention. You want to help somebody. You want to see them benefited. You want to see them be happy. You want to offer a meal to somebody because they're hungry or whatever. There's that in the heart, like empathy. So that's very wholesome. So the result of that can't be suffering. So the result of that can only be happiness. So that's the like exact nature of karma, is that. But there's a time lag, so that's the unfortunate part. If we received it immediately, nobody would do anything wrong. Nobody would hurt each other or get angry or take advantage of each other, and we'd be living in a celestial paradise. But because there's this time lag, we get confused. We don't know. So that's why the practice, it takes time to build up that momentum of wholesome mental states. Then we'll start receiving the results of it, and then it goes from there. And then the faith really gets strong, and then it gets really fun, actually. And it's like then it's like, okay, this actually works. This is pretty amazing. And the Buddha is. I knew the Buddha was great, but Buddha is even better than that. So the faith just. That's when it gets informed by wisdom, and you start discernment or wisdom, what we call panya. That's when the heart sees automatically. We don't need to study the scriptures. That's when the heart sees automatically. So I just always use this one analogy because I think it's the best, of the hand in the fire. So when the heart sees clearly what the causes of suffering are, it can only withdraw. It can't go in again. That's like putting your hand in a fire. When you know what a fire does to your hand, you see a fire there, you can't just, it's very difficult to even will yourself to put your hand in a fire because it's so painful. So when your hand is in a fire, say for some reason your hand is in a fire, you don't think like, oh, let me check the manual, let me check the instruction manual for what to do when my hand is in a fire. The hand just automatically retracts. So that's what it's like with when the heart starts to develop wisdom, when it really sees the suffering of anger, and then it will retract. It can't go into it anymore. But it takes training. It has to be taught. See, the problem though here with this analogy is it's like the heart is the hand that's always only knows the fire. It doesn't know anything else. It's never been out of the fire before. So that's the kind of fun contemplation of like, what would it be like if the heart wasn't suffering? But the Buddha used some very strong terms. He said it's the heart is on fire. It's you need to get it out quickly, and it's immense suffering. We've been in suffering for so long, we don't really know how strong it is, how extreme the nature of suffering actually is. So wanting to actually, that's just spiritual practice. That's on the ultimate level, nibbana, which just means cooling, the cooling of all those fires. So the Buddha called spiritual practice is when we train the mind in stages to do this. But then and this is a long-term project, I'm not speaking from experience in this level here, but like the Buddha saying, if the mind attains nibbana, or the goal of practice, then it's more spiritual than the spiritual. So like we want to be more spiritual, but then the Buddha said, well, you can even take it further. You can be more spiritual than the spiritual, and that would be nibbana, or the actual goal of practice. And then it's also good to contemplate what is that, like what would somebody experience like that. That's the Buddha puts that out there as something desirable. One misunderstanding that can come up is that an enlightened being, or what we call an arahant, doesn't feel anything, but it's actually the opposite. The arahant is one who's always mindful, which what that means is they feel everything completely fully. So everything is felt completely fully, but they're, having met some great senior monks myself, you could say like, oh, a lot of them are just completely ordinary. You wouldn't think on just meeting them briefly that they were special in any way until you live with them and you see that they follow the path of non-suffering, and they don't suffer over anything, and they never get angry, and just you notice the unusual qualities kind of later if you live with someone for a long time, or they are super humble. They don't like go around saying, "Hey, I'm an arahant," and, you bow to me or whatever, and anyway, I digressed a little bit. Good. 10:55. Okay.